Hello again, everybody, and welcome to our Lecture 3 on Unit 6, dealing with ancient Rome and the rise of Christianity. As we are seeing from the change of the BCE, before current era, into the new era, or the current era, we'll see a change in religious perspective, a lot of that dealing with the creation of a new, different religion known as Christianity. So, during the lecture, as usual, please make sure you get your cell phones, tablets, all those distractions put away so that we can focus on this particular unit. As always, if you have any questions after the lecture, please feel free to let me know, and I'll be more than happy to answer any question that you may have to the best of my knowledge. And with that, let's go. So, ancient Rome and the rise of Christianity. Setting the stage, so the beginning of our lecture, we're looking at, while religion played an important role in Roman society, the worship of Roman gods was impersonal and often practiced without a great deal of emotion. They did have their religions, lots of different religions, by the way, but they weren't the big thing that you might think. They had their religions of Mars and their astrological signs, but it wasn't something that they took all that to heart. They looked for signs and indications that things would happen. But again, they were like the Sunday type person of religion. They were religious when they wanted to be religious, when it suited their needs. But beyond that, it wasn't a big thing to them other than when they wanted it to be. So keep that in mind. Also, as the empire grew, so too did the new religion called Christianity. As the time period changed, as I mentioned before, from the BCE to the current era, Christianity would take hold. People would find it a very interesting religion, as we'll see, and it would begin to become more popular because of its teachings and its inclusion for everybody, not just the rich. And again, we'll talk more about that later. So Christianity. Here on the right side, you see Judea, which is present-day Israel, which at the time is where Jesus Christ would have called his home. This would be a stomping ground, particularly around Jerusalem, through Gaza, kind of all over the place there. So you kind of get a visual of his homeland there. Early on in the Pax Romana, the new religion, Christianity, emerged in a distant corner of the empire. As you can see here, Judea, or present-day Israel, which is on the far east side of the Roman Empire. Many different religions existed in the empire at the time, and by 63 BC, Rome has conquered Judea, where most of the Jewish people lived. We won't get into the history of why they all lived there. It had to deal some of it with the Exodus and people just coming back to the homeland of Moses and things like that. But the majority of the Jewish people, or the Hebrews, lived in this particular part of the empire. Now the Romans, when they did conquer Judea, they allowed the Jewish people to worship their one God. That is what made Judaism, or Hebrew, unique in the fact that it only had one God. The Romans had multiple gods. Again, they had Mars, they had Jupiter, all their numerous amounts of gods. But the Hebrews, or the Jews, had only one God, which made them unique and different. And sometimes uniqueness and being different scares people. But because the Judea was on the far side of the empire, the home capital of Rome, or the main city of Rome, really didn't pay much attention to them. It was under their control. They did have soldiers there and stuff like that, but it wasn't anything that they really cared much about at the time when the whole thing started, from the time that they took over Judea till a little bit more into and actually after Jesus Christ was around. So, many Jews reluctantly lived under the Roman rule. However, some wanted to revolt against Rome and believed a Messiah would come to lead their people to freedom. this is kind of a prediction here if you think about it. People don't like being ruled by somebody else who's not like them. And they put up with the Romans, but they were hoping somebody would come and save the day. So, in comes this Jesus character. At least Jesus as we translate it to be in their language, it would be Yahweh. Excuse me. So, born around the year 4 BC, as best as we can tell, in the small city of Bethlehem, according to biblical records. He worshipped God and followed Jewish law. Both his parents, Mary and Joseph, were Hebrews or Jews, and he was brought up in their law and in their traditions. So Jesus was a Jew, as it turns out to be. Things happened from the time he was born to the time he was 30. He got a job. He was a carpenter with his father Joseph. There are stories about him as a child and him learning how to be a good Jew and even possibly recognizing the fact that he may have been the Son of God according to Christian tradition. But around 30 years old, he began to preach to villagers about God and his word. And he did this using parables. Parables are simple short stories that have a moral lesson to communicate ideas. And he would use these parables, much to the dismay of some of the religious scholars at the time, to kind of make them think and occasionally put them in place. And at the time, here's this young guy questioning the old religious gurus of the Jewish faith. So he's kind of stomping on some toes that he probably should not have, ideally. But because of what he believed and how he interpreted the Bible and the Old Testament, he did his best to kind of put these scholars in their place on his interpretations of the Scripture. During his travels, he was able to recruit 12 disciples to join him in spreading his ideas. These people were called apostles in Jerusalem. Apostles simply mean people on the move. Some Jews in Jerusalem welcomed Jesus. Many of the priests, however, felt threatened that he threatened their leadership, as we kind of just mentioned a second ago. Roman authorities felt Jesus would lead the Jews into a revolt against their rule. And this was more like a regional Romans, the leadership that lived in Judea at the time. Jesus was not as popular to the rest of the Roman Empire. He was just becoming more and more of a known character just in that area of Judea. The Romans were kind of curious, or concerned rather, because as you get one kind of a guy starting to get a bunch of followers, they were getting nervous that one day, if he gets enough followers, he might convince them to take up arms against Roman rule. So they kind of kept their eye on him as best as they could, but they didn't do anything until later on when they were kind of convinced by some other people that were also not happy with him, which we'll get to. So, according to the Bible, and the Gospels in the Bible, Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples and arrested by the Romans and killed by a crucifixion. Again, a person being bound to a cross and left to die. What makes this, it doesn't sound like it's a big deal. You're just hanging there with your arms open, spread out like that. But it's actually very painful. What happens is the way that the cross is designed, your arms are hanging up, all the weight is pushing down on your shoulders. The platform that you're standing on is at an incline, so your feet have to kind of stand on an incline, and they're just sliding down as the day and the sweat starts piling up. They have to push themselves up because as you're holding yourself here, it's restricting your airways. Very, very much a painful type of death. As the story goes, a couple hours after Jesus was on this cross and these other two individuals, the soldiers would come up, break his legs, making it even more difficult for him to hold himself up. And then finally, several hours later, he would suffocate and succumb to his injuries. Now, the interesting part of the story is after his death. Rumors started spreading that Jesus had not died, but actually had risen from the dead and had commanded his disciples to spread his teachings. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole Easter and the resurrection story, but the stories are out there. We don't know if it was Peter and his group that put these out there, but it was believed that he rose from the dead and commanded his disciples to continue his teachings. 40 days after this rising from the dead, it was reported by his disciples that Jesus had actually risen to heaven. So the reason people did not know Jesus had risen was, according to the Bible, he looked different. He was still Jesus to his disciples. His disciples recognized him by his words and his actions, but nobody else really recognized him because he just looked different. So that's kind of the traditional reasoning behind that story, why nobody else recognized him except usually his disciples. There's not a lot of stories beyond that. So now that Jesus is dead, we're going to look at how Christianity even spread beyond Judea. So, as you can imagine, the followers of Jesus Christ were called Christians. How original, right? The disciples preached the message of Christianity all throughout the Roman world as Jesus had instructed them to do. Peter would kind of be the spearhead when it came to spreading the word. He established Christianity in Rome itself by actually traveling to the city of Rome and spread the word of Jesus. Paul, on the other hand, who was technically not one of his big disciples or his apostles, he would come around later after Jesus died, but Paul would probably play the most influential role in spreading Christianity. And he did this by actually not staying in one place, but moving from town to town, telling all these different stories of Jesus and his life and how believing in Jesus can save you. He spread Christianity all throughout the Mediterranean region. Very smart man, very liked man, very good at communicating, so he was able to spread his word quite effectively. What made Christianity different and unique from the other religions, as I mentioned before, was the fact it was the belief in one God. And it was the idea that anybody could be a Christian, not just the rich or the poor. He actually invited the rich, invited the poor, and treated them all as equals under God, that they are all sons and daughters of God. Whereas in other religions, or you had to do certain things, you had to be a certain type of class. Christianity invited sinners, recognizing that everybody is a sinner, and that's okay. And he also recognized that as sinners, if we believe as sinners that we have done wrong and we ask for forgiveness from God, we'll receive it. So recognizing the fact we're sinners and that we can be forgiven was something really new and novel as compared to the Hindu belief or the Jewish belief that that everybody's going to go to hell basically unless you were perfect. They lived by the old commandments, the old 10 commandments. The Jews and the Hebrews did. Where Jesus Christ said, "Hey, those commandments are good, but we're changing them. We're making them more modern. You can be a sinner. That's okay." So it really made a lot of people want to become Christians based on this idea that they can be forgiven for their sins. Back onto Paul here real quick. His letters became part of the New Testament in the Bible. A lot of his letters to Timothy, Galatians, things like that, he wrote to the different churches throughout the region, helped spread the word as well to a lot of these smaller churches that he was establishing along his travels. So, Christians, as you can expect, are not going to be liked by everybody. We see that in history, all throughout history. We even see it in modern times today. The Romans were not tolerant towards Christians as Christianity was becoming more and more popular. They refused to honor the empire with sacrifices, or the emperor with sacrifices. To honor the empire with sacrifices was to acknowledge the fact that the emperor was some sort of god or supreme being, and the Christians would not have that. They believed there is one God, one Savior, and you worship Him, the one God. You don't worship or give favor to an emperor the way that Roman tradition would have them do. So the emperor was kind of taken aback by these Christians who were not willing to honor him. They refused to worship Roman gods. To protect the state, Christians were used as scapegoats, blamed for social and economic problems. Because they're different, they were considered outsiders. They were always the ones that were blamed for different things going on, whether it was a famine or some sort of bad time, some war perhaps, or people's deaths. It was always the Christians' fault because you had to blame somebody. Let's blame the outsiders. That still goes on today too, where people don't understand different religions or cultures and beliefs, so we'll just blame what we don't understand. And it was the same back then as it is today in some respects. So keep that in mind, and hopefully we can learn from that lesson. Many Christians became martyrs, or people who suffered and died for their beliefs. Paul was executed. Peter was executed. All because of their faith and preaching their faith. So it was difficult to be a Christian, depending on where you lived and how adamant you were about your faith. However, Christianity did continue to spread due to the fact that all people were welcome, not just the rich. Whether you were diseased, whether you were rich, old, young, it didn't matter. Everybody was welcomed because we're all sinners. That was the idea. Don't leave anybody out. Jesus and God accept everybody. So, how long did this go on for? Well, we're talking about hundreds of years that Christians were kind of shunned and given the bad reputation. Even an Emperor Nero would enjoy torturing Christians. He would actually put them on display for parties on crosses and hang them on crosses, burning their bodies on the crosses while his spectators and his guests would watch. Very nasty stuff that lasted hundreds of years. But it wasn't until around 313 AD when Emperor Constantine issued what's known as the Edict of Milan, which says that it grants freedom for everybody to worship however they want within the Roman Empire. You could be whatever religion, and the Roman government did not care. Think of this as like the first freedom of religion of the world, where people were not persecuted because of their religion, whatever that religion would be. Later on, another emperor by the name of Theodosius, who came after Constantine, would one up that Edict of Milan and basically making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So in a way, for Christianity, it was a step forward, making Christianity the official religion, but at the same time, it kind of got rid of the idea of the freedom of religion. So, kind of like a one step forward, one step back, depending on which religion you were a part of at the time. And finally, for our last slide, here's simply just a quick hierarchical display of the who's in charge of the church and their listing. As you can see, at the bottom of the list is the community, the regular parishioners, the everyday people who are within their churches. Within each church is their priest and their diocese, who is the church leadership. Above, and that's usually each square on the bottom would represent maybe like one city, okay? So there'd be a community of all these churches within one city. And within all those cities, they would report to one bishop who was one guy responsible for keeping an eye on all those churches within that particular region or city. And above the bishops would be the archbishops and the pope. Okay. The archbishops are kind of in control of the bishops, who are in control of the diocese and the churches. And then above the bishops and the archbishops would be the Pope, who is the patriarch, also known as the Holy See, or the Pope again. His proper name is actually the Bishop of Rome. That's his official title, but it represents him being the most highest ranking person in the Catholic Church. All right, and with that, I'm done with this lecture. We'll come back and talk about some more information relating to Christianity as we get into the Middle Ages, and how that was affecting some bad times going on in the Middle Ages. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Feel free to look through it again if you need to get any more notes. I'd encourage you to ask questions of me if you have any. And other than that, I'm good. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again soon.